is something about a story well told. You can feel it in the hush that falls over a room when someone says, "Let me tell you about the time." You can feel it in the weight of a name, the sound of an old hymn, the scent of your grandmother's kitchen. Stories are how we pass down more than just facts. They carry a tone of voice. They shape a memory. The smell of something you probably weren't supposed to touch before dinner, but did anyway. Stories carry the whisper of that grace that once caught us right where we fell. And Psalm 78 begins with an invitation to this kind of story. "Give ear, O my people," the psalmist says. "Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." This is more than just a casual request. This is a call to attention. This is a gathering of the people to remember, not just for the sake of nostalgia, but for the sake of their own formation. "I will utter dark sayings from of old," the psalmist says, "truths hidden in shadow, but weighty and woven with memory." These are more than just simple tales. They are stories of desert survival and divine mercy, of covenant and of complaint, of rebellion and of return, and the psalmist is clear. We must not keep these stories to ourselves. "We will not hide them from our children," he writes, "but tell them to the coming generation, tell them the glorious deeds of the Lord and God's might and the wonders God has done." This is more than a handing down of history. It's a passing on of hope. The kind of hope that's seen the Red Sea split. The kind of hope that's seen manna fall from heaven. The kind of hope that's seen water gush from a dry rock. The kind of hope that remembers what God has done and dares to believe that God is not finished yet. Elie Wiesel once said, "God made man because God loves stories." And we are, at our best, storytellers. We are a storytelling people, not just because we want to remember what happened, but because we want to remember who we are. A people without a story is a people without roots. And a people without roots can be blown by every wind of fear, by every whisper of doubt, by every passing headline, or worse, by every viral trend that tells us the key to happiness is another new supplement, another morning routine, or buying another new Stanley thermos so that you can have every single color in the set. This is why remembering matters. Not just in church, but around our tables. Not just in sermons, but in everyday speech, in the way you talk to your children, in the way you walk through hard seasons, in the way you look back on your life and still see grace in every part of it. Think of it like this. Reading a story is different than being in one, but telling a story that you've lived through, that's testimony. That's how faith gets passed on, not just as information, but as something that can create transformation. In the film The Lion King, there's a moment when Simba, who is exiled and ashamed, has a vision of his father Mufasa saying, "Simba, you have forgotten who you are, and in doing so, you have forgotten me." And that really gets at what's going on here. There's a connection between our going back and our going forward. And the only way we go back is through memory, through story, through remembering both the pain and the promise. And Psalm 78 tells us this remembering is an act of faith. And that telling our story, especially when it's hard, especially when it's unfinished, is an act of courage. Because someone is listening. A friend may be listening. A family member may be listening. A neighbor may be listening. Maybe someone who's still wondering if God can be trusted is listening. And of course, sometimes the ones who are listening most closely are the ones with juice boxes in their hands and glitter on their faces and fingertips. This week we'll see a lot of that. This week is Vacation Bible School here at our church, a beautiful, sometimes chaotic, always sacred week where we practice exactly what this psalm describes. Passing on our story. Passing on the story and passing it on down to our children. We sing it, we snack it, we act it out, we glue it on popsicle sticks, and we tell it again and again, because even when it looks like all it is crafts and games, what we're really doing is discipleship. What we're really doing is spiritual formation. What we're really doing is hope. And when we tell the story truthfully and tenderly, we're not just keeping tradition alive, we're participating in something holy. We're saying with our lives what the psalmist says in these verses: God's story is still unfolding. And if remembering is holy work, then forgetting is a holy risk. Because when the remembering stops, something more than tradition is in danger. Our very identity begins to unravel. We're, a forgetful people. Not just then, but now. We forget who we are. We forget what we've seen. We forget what God has already done. And when we forget, we lose more than memory. We lose direction. Verse 7 here gives us the purpose of our remembering. And the psalmist says, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep God's commandments. Talking about our children and grandchildren there. In other words, remembering is not meant to be a passive thing. Remembering is an active act of formation. Hope takes root not in wishful thinking, but in the soil of testimony. You tell the story over and over and over again, and it reminds you God has shown up before, and God will show up again. Every time we see here that Israel forgets, every time they fail to pass down the story, they fall into despair or idolatry. They grasp for golden calves or put their trust in kings instead of putting their trust in God. They forget the God who freed them from Pharaoh, and they end up back in chains of their own making. And we see the forgetting here is not just personal. It's generational. Yet memory can be nurtured like fire through ritual and rhythm. That's why our tradition keeps telling this story week after week, season after season. That's why the Passover meal is structured like a story. That's why communion is both remembering and proclamation. Why Jesus said, "Do this often in remembrance of me." Because memory in the spiritual sense is not just about looking back, it's about pulling the past into the present and letting it shape how we live right now. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, he didn't just change the sport. He changed our national story. He reshaped it, and that story could have been lost, but voices like Rachel Robinson and Branch Rickey and a generation and generations of civil rights leaders kept it alive, because they knew that if we forget what was risked and what was won, we will lose our resolve to keep moving forward. And the same is true with our faith. The stories we remember shape the people we become. If we only remember our failures, we're tempted to live in shame. If we only remember the glory days, we can fall into pride. But if we remember both the grace that met us in both of those places, the God who held us and the God who brought us home from exile, we learn to walk humbly and trust deeply and live generously. Walter Brueggemann put it this way: what's at stake in our remembering is not simply the accuracy of the past, but the possibility of a transformed future. And that's what the psalm is doing here. That's the work. It's rehearsing hope. It's placing God's mighty acts in the mouths of God's people so that when the time comes, we know how to speak. So that when the next generation asks, does God still care about us? We don't have to rely on theories because we have our stories. So we need to write them down, all of them. Not just these stories, your stories. Tell them at the dinner table. Teach them to your children, and not just the shiny parts, but the wounds and the scars too, because those scars may become signposts of grace for someone else. And when you find yourself forgetting, when your hope grows thin, reach back into the stories again. Dust off the old tales. Remember how the Red Sea parted and how water came from a dry rock, how love showed up in Bethlehem, and how the tomb still stands empty. Because in remembering, we don't just keep the past alive, we keep faith alive. If forgetting disconnects us, remembering roots us again. And then it strengthens us as we continue to move forward together. And we must do that because the psalmist isn't only calling us to remember where we've been, but to live like people who know where this story is going. See, the goal isn't just preservation, it's participation. Memory is supposed to become mission because the story of God isn't a finished script. It's still unfolding. Psalm 78 isn't only about remembering, it's about retelling. And it's not only about retelling, it's about reliving. It's about passing on a living and breathing faith because the goal of our lives is not to create archives. It is to create witnesses. You'll notice the psalm doesn't say, write this down and then store it in a vault. No. It says, tell it to the next generation so that they should set their hope in God. This is legacy language. This is generational language. It's about forward momentum. The story doesn't end with Moses or Miriam or Paul or Mary Magdalene or the summer you gave your life to Christ or your grandmother's faith. The story is still unfolding and it's now in your hands. You and I, we're chapters in the story. And the next generation will learn to trust God not only because of scriptures and songs, but because of what they see written in your life. And how you serve, and how you love, and how you struggle, and then keep on singing. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, faith is taking the first step even when you can't see the whole staircase. And that's what we're called to do. Not to walk a perfect path, but to take the next faithful step. Trusting that the same God who split the sea is walking with us still. This is why your story matters. Not just the highlight reel, but the whole thing. The detours and the doubts and the deserts. Because someone else is in the middle of their wilderness right now. And your story may be the exact manna that they need. You don't have to have a pulpit or a podcast. Your story, just as it is right now, might be the reason someone else believes they're not alone. You don't need a microphone to tell the truth. You just have to show up, open-hearted, honest, unashamed of God's grace. And sometimes, it takes a spark of courage to share that truth, especially when it's still unfolding, when it's still being written. But that's what makes it so powerful. So friends, speak your faith, your story, with courage, love with abandon, walk with humility, and if you trip along the way, welcome to the club. Because the saints have always walked with a limp. So let your life be part of the story that gives someone else hope, because God's story is our story, and the story is not finished yet. Amen.